Hello, my name is Tom Fletcher. I'm the Chief of Police for the Blue Earth Police Department. Today we're going to be holding a virtual community notification and education meeting about a level 2 sex offender who is reintegrating into our community. Under normal circumstances, we would host this as a meeting with the public, but unfortunately due to the constraints of the COVID-19 pandemic, we aren't able to do so at this time. The purpose of this meeting is to inform you about the sex offender registration program, to give you information about the community notification process, and to give you specific information about a sex offender who was moved into our community named Timothy Lincoln in the 200 block of East 2nd Street. This meeting is also to enhance our community members' individual and collective safety. I realize that as you watch this meeting, you'll have questions. And I hope that during this presentation, we'll be able to answer some of those questions. With that, I'd like to introduce Brad Vandervet from the Minnesota Department of Corrections.
Well, hello and thank you. I'm going to start my presentation with just kind of an overview of the information I'm going to share and what you can expect as I go through my slides. My initial portion is going to really discuss the risk management system as a whole, some of those foundational components that are utilized throughout the state of Minnesota when it comes to dealing with individuals such as Mr. Lincoln in the communities. And then I will use that information as kind of an overlay as we get into the specifics about him today. And then at the end, I will go over some resources for you to utilize and apply into those family safety plans and larger community safety plans that you already have in place. So where I really like to begin with conversations like this is with what we all as a community really know. And that is that those individuals who engage in this type of conduct and behavior, sexual harm and sexual assault, exist. They exist in all communities throughout the state and beyond. What we really look to is what is it we're doing now with our risk management systems throughout the state to address those who come into our system and we become aware of. And so one of those first components that really came online, one of those foundational pieces of that management system, is the registry. Initially known as the Sex Offender Registry, and it came online in state law in 1991. And is really founded on the hard work and advocacy efforts of families such as the Jacob Wetterling family following the abduction of Jacob, and onto the Jacob Wetterling Resource Center and other advocacy groups where they had gone around the state and then again broader and had asked law enforcement, what more can we do to assist you in your policing efforts, to help you be as proactive and as effective as possible? And law enforcement resoundingly said, what we need is a system that collates our data across the state. Because up until the registry, what would inevitably happen is that those individuals engaging in this kind of harm would be known by the law enforcement agency that prosecuted it and investigated it, perhaps the community county agencies, and that would be about the extent of it unless that individual then went to another neighboring community, in which point that information was shared, but it would be shared after the fact. The registry allowed law enforcement to have a proactive system where they could look across the state at all those that are known to the risk management system and be preemptive on potential issues. So one of the questions about the sex offender registry that often will come up in meetings is, well, what kind of information does the registry collect and maintain? Well, the registry collects and maintains things like the registrant's address, primary address, and secondary addresses. That would include places they may frequent, such as family members' homes, rental properties, vacation properties, and things of that nature. All must be made known to law enforcement. Other things they must register would be their employment, where they work, and if they operate motor vehicles for that employer, they must also register those. They must register where they attend school, and any vehicles that they use, own, or possess must be known to law enforcement. Other items would be things that they rent, like storage lockers and so on. So you can see the robustness of the registry and the data it collects. The way the registry law was set up was that the information collected and maintained by the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension would be considered private data. And as such, this information is predominantly for law enforcement purposes only. But for meetings like today, I'll be able to share with you at least some snapshots from that registry to give you a broader overview and outlook of what it is we're talking about. So the next question that will often come up when I talk about the registry is who then is required to register in our state? Now initially when it came online, it focused solely on sex offenders, those who had been charged with or convicted of criminal sexual conduct, or those engaging in sexual offending behavior towards or relating children, so child pornography and things of that nature. But in Minnesota, we actually saw the value of the registry to the point where the legislature decided it made sense to broaden the scope, to the point where now we collect and maintain registry information on those who are charged with or convicted of incidences like kidnapping and false imprisonment. And this is why some of you may recall the name change, where it went from the sex offender registry to the predatory offender registry, because we collect more than just information on sex offenders. And an easy way to keep it straight in your mind is this, is that all sex offenders are predatory offenders, while not all predatory offenders are sex offenders. So one of the slides that you'll be able to see that I've put together for you in this presentation shows the amount of individuals currently registered within our state. As of January 1st, 2020, you will see that there are 18,798 individuals who are on or subject to the registry. As of the 29th of May, there were 60 registered individuals in Faribault County, 5 of whom are those subject to broad public notification. And that means those who are designated risk level 3 or those who have been civilly committed for sexually offending conduct. You'll see Blue Earth has 9 registered individuals within its zip code reporting that address, none of whom are a risk level 3. One of whom now you're learning about today will be subject to that broad public notification. And you'll see from the slide other neighboring communities as well. The number to the left, the larger number, is those who are registered individuals. They could be no risk level assigned or risk levels 1 or 2. And the smaller number to the right is those individuals from that group that are subject to broad public notification. Another component of our state's risk management system that I want to share with you today is the Community Notification Act. And the Community Notification Act came online in 1997 and is founded on the research and data that shows that a well-informed community is in fact a safer community. And we at the Department of Corrections commend the folks and their hard work here in the Blue Earth Police Department and their efforts to ensure that this information gets out to the broadest amount of people possible. So because the reason we're here today is the Community Notification Act, it makes sense to go into detail a little further as to how that works. As you saw from my earlier information, not everybody is subject to a risk level assessment or notification. So in Minnesota, in order to be assessed, you must first cross the threshold of a prison, be it our state prisons, other state prisons to include U.S. territories, federal or military prisons, or you must have been civilly committed for sexual offense behavior. It does not apply to, and you will not receive a risk level assessment and assignment if you were a juvenile at the time of your registrable offense, or if you received a stayed or probationary sentence as a result of your conviction. And this is how you have those individuals with no risk level assigned. So when it comes down to assessment, assignment, and notification, the next question is typically who does what? Well, the Department of Corrections through the Notification Act is tasked with assessing risk and assigning the risk level, and that is done through the End of Confinement Review Committee, or ECRC. Any registered individual that crosses that threshold will be subject to an assessment 90 days prior to their release or earlier. And that assessment consists of an exhaustive document review across all available information sources nationally and even internationally in some cases, where we will pull all the incidences, known information on the individual, and an assessor will then apply a risk assessment tool known as the MinSOST, which is the Minnesota Sex Offender Screening Tool. Now, the reason that's an important piece to note is the MinSOST is born out of a number or two specific research studies conducted here in our state. In 1990, as these laws were starting to come online, the Department of Corrections began a decades-long research study from 1990 all the way through the early 2000s, where they followed initially over 3,166 known sex offenders from the point of their release through their duration in the community for that research study. And there was a follow-up study done in 2012. And the information they gained about those individuals' successes and failures is what informs that risk assessment tool. It created those vetted and scientifically proven known predictive risk factors. And so today, when I refer to a level 1, a level 2, or a level 3, know that I am referring to that core research group. I'm saying a level 1 individual possesses a lower amount of risk factors compared to that group of peers. A level 2 has a moderate amount of risk factors to that group, and a level 3 has a higher amount of risk factors as compared to that group in the research study. So once a risk level is assessed and assigned, the handoff then goes to law enforcement. And law enforcement will provide notification within the scope of the risk level assigned. With level 1 individuals, law enforcement will notify other law enforcement or correctional agencies. They may notify victims of or witnesses to the offense if they've requested that enhanced notification. And they may notify adult household members living in the immediate household with the registrant. And that is the scope of a level 1 notification. A level 2 notification builds on that in that all of those individuals we just talked about a moment ago, and in addition, law enforcement may designate any individual or entity that they determine to be at specific risk based on the registrant's known pattern of offending behavior. Now, often it's believed that this means with a level 2 individual that law enforcement will notify schools and daycares. And while that very well may be true, it's not always the case. And here's an example of how that might work. Let's say law enforcement receives notification on a level 2 registrant coming into the community, and upon their review of the dossier that they're provided, they determine that this individual focuses their offending conduct and behavior on adult females at social gatherings. Think of things like bars or concert venues. Law enforcement may determine at this point with that individual that it would not enhance public safety to provide notification to the local daycare that provides care, and their primary clientele are children from birth to school age. It may only cause to create more fear and confusion. Now, on the other side of the coin, let's say law enforcement gets notification on a level 2 registrant who's coming into the community, and they've seen and determined through their review of the documentation that this individual focuses their behavior on unaccompanied minors, teenagers, who are out after school has ended and before they have to go home, and law enforcement knows of a particular teen hotspot or hangout location in their community. With a level 2 notification, law enforcement may very well then determine in that scenario that they will provide the proprietor of that location where the teens congregate of this individual's information and essentially say, look, if you see this person in and around the area loitering or hanging around or talking and engaging with the children, give us a call. We'd like to come out and meet up with him and find out what's going on. And that is the nuance of a level 2 notification. And then on to a level 3 notification, broad public notification. And this can come in many shapes and formats. It really comes down to how law enforcement directly communicates most effectively with its community. And again, we commend the Blue Earth Police Department in its efforts here today. So I mentioned that the Department of Corrections, through this research study, collects and maintains a great deal of data about this important topic. And so one of the things I want to put in your mind as I go into some of these data statistics is an analogy of a funnel. Think of a funneling effect when it comes to those who engage in sexual harm. What we know across the nation is that of those offenses that occur in our communities, only a portion of those go on to get reported to law enforcement at all. And we know that as that funnel narrows, that those that get reported to law enforcement, only a portion of those will go on to potentially receive charges. And of those charged, only a portion of that group may go on to receive sentences. And of those sentenced, as you've seen that funnel narrow further, only a portion of that group will go on to cross the threshold of a state prison system. So you see this narrowing effect go further and further. So at the very end of that funnel are those individuals that cross our state prison threshold. And year after year, that number does fluctuate and change, but the breakdown of risk level assignments remains very static. Year after year, despite the number, the average breakdown of levels assigned is the majority are levels 1 and 2, those not subject to broad public notification. 15% constitute that level 3 group. So you see that ever narrowing scope. And so while the individual we're here to talk about today has earned your awareness and scrutiny, we want you to also keep that awareness broad because we see just how big that funnel really is. As it sits on the 29th, I ran the numbers in our state. There were 429 individuals statewide who are out in our communities subject to broad public notification. And this information is available to you to look at as well on the Minnesota Department of Corrections website on the public registrant search function. You can go on there and you can see all 429 of them, or whatever the number may be at this point. The numbers do fluctuate and change as these individuals do move. Other data and information I want to share with you as you're contemplating all of this and how to apply it to your family and community safety plans. Information from our research, such as the relationship between those who engage in this kind of harm and conduct and those who they harm, we know. And we've seen cross-research studies as well, and you'll see from my slide here, this one is from the U.S. Department of Justice in 2000, that the majority of those engaging in this kind of harm have a relationship with the people they hurt. They're either family members or acquaintances. From this information, you'll see that 7% fall into that stranger category. Now that is something that's really worth breaking down because as you're no doubt contemplating this, you're thinking, okay, I have a great deal of control over family members that have access to those I care for most and acquaintances that they are allowed to have and make and maintain. But where we get our most alarm is off that stranger group. So it's worth breaking that down further. One thing I want you to know as you're contemplating this is from that study is the researchers had to create a cutoff point. And that cutoff point was 24 hours. If through the data they could not determine that a relationship existed between the offender and the victim that extended beyond 24 hours, they went into the stranger category. So inevitably what this would mean is those scenarios where a teen met someone at a house party and the night was going the way it was going and they left of their own free will with that individual and then the night took a turn or the parents became aware. That scenario would end up in the stranger category. But what we tend to think more of when we think of strangers is that person, that individual lurking just beyond our awareness, just outside of our sightlines, who has ill intent. And that group falls more into a 3% category. Now that is cold comfort, I'm well aware. But as you're contemplating how to apply this information to your own safety plans, I want you to have that in mind. That while these individuals who we've identified deserve that specific focus, we don't want that focus to be solely on them. We need it to be broad as well. Other information that I think is valuable as you're contemplating these safety plans is the age breakdowns of those harmed. And you'll see from the data I've got here that the majority of those hurt are children. And you'll look even further and you'll see the narrowest age range from our research is the 13 to 17 age group. That constitutes 33% of those harmed by this kind of conduct and behavior. That is 9% of the population, and that is very much worth looking closer at. So what do we know? Well, we know that that 0 to 12 age range is still very much under the watchful eyes of those who care for them most. Parents, trusted adults and loved ones, community members at large. And they're assisting these children and vetting the people coming into their lives. And so what we as organizations like the Department of Corrections and law enforcement want to do is make sure that those decision makers, those trusted adults, have the tools they need to make those healthy, appropriate decisions as to who gets to have access. But ultimately, when we get to that 13 to 17 age range, we end up getting what we as a community work so hard to achieve, which is a place where our children are safe to grow and thrive and develop and explore their own autonomy. And that is the very thing that can be exploited because now they are out in the communities making relationships outside of the watchful eyes of those who are there to keep them safe and protected. So what we've gotten away from as a community is that older model of the talk, where we took our teen at that critical age as parents and we began to pull back the veil just enough to show them that the world was not as safe as it had been made to be for them when they were younger. And often teens will reject this because they find that it's not aligning with their perception of reality thus far. And so helping them to understand is difficult to do if we just dump it on them at that critical time. What we find is more effective is that a lot of little talks all the way up and through into those critical teenage years and on in adulthood that build on each other in an age-appropriate way all the way along as the child is growing and learning, that help them to understand the world in which they live. We want to make sure, predominantly, above all else, that what we share with our children in these safety plans does not create fear. Because we know that scared kids do not equal safer kids. But what we also need our children to understand is that nice people do not always equal safe people. And so I will give you some additional resources for you to look at as you're wanting to get more information on how to have these conversations with your children. Entities like the Jacob Wetterling Resource Center and local victim advocacy groups are tremendous starting points. And your community at large, working together with your law enforcement agency to ensure that you're doing the very best you can to keep your children educated, informed, and healthy and safe. All right. So now with all the information I've provided you thus far, I'd like to take that and use it as an overlay as we begin to discuss the specifics about the man you're here to learn about. This is Timothy Lincoln. And first thing I want to talk about is photographs. Photographs will be updated a minimum of annually, every 12 months or thereabouts, or should the individual significantly change their appearance? So if you see Mr. Lincoln and you see that he has significantly modified or altered or changed his appearance, by all means, please notify law enforcement, and they will ensure that updated photos are taken and brought to the BCA, in which point I will obtain them and make sure they are on the web for as long as he is subject to broad public notification. You will always have an accurate photographic depiction of what he looks like. These are Mr. Lincoln's vitals. He's currently 38 years of age, and he is residing in the 200 block of East 2nd Street here in Blue Earth. Now, often in meetings like this, one of the questions that will arise is, Brad, can we know where he lives? Will you tell us the house? We'd have a great deal of comfort in knowing where he resides. And the answer is, remembering back to my earlier information, that the data that's collected by the Predatory Offender Registry is private data. So we can share the proximal address. Know that your law enforcement agencies and county and state agencies know exactly where he resides, works, what he drives, and so on. And no doubt those who live in and among this area, this proximity, will become aware of Mr. Lincoln in time. They will see him in his comings and goings, and they will share this information among each other, and that's okay. What we do not want, though, as a state agency is to somehow put this information out there where someone from outside of your community, who has no vested stake or interest in what happens here in Blue Earth, come in and exact some vigilante revenge scenario that does nothing to mitigate risk, does nothing to deter future potential harmful behavior, and only serves to disrupt what you've worked so hard here to create in your neighborhoods. I'm flashing up just a quick paragraph of Mr. Lincoln's registrable offense behavior. This is not an exhaustive criminal history. It relates to those incidences that put him on the registry. And so I really want to just get right into the details of what happened. So in 2002, Mr. Lincoln was convicted of criminal sexual conduct 5th degree in Wright County. Mr. Lincoln, after a night of drinking, was fumbling around in the community, checking door handles to various properties that were not his own, and he'd found one unlocked. And he entered the building and began rummaging around, and he went into one of the rooms where there was an adult female asleep. He began to assault her. She woke and screamed, and then he turned and ran and fled. And through good policing efforts, through latent fingerprints and research from the law enforcement side, he was caught and brought to justice. And for that crime, he received a 33-month commit to the Commissioner of Corrections prison sentence and was placed onto probation. That sentence was stayed for 20 years. Now this, at that moment in 2002, would have been one of those individuals who had no risk level assigned because he would not have crossed the threshold of prison. And you'll see from my slide that that stay was vacated in 2004, at which point he did then serve that prison time. But I want to back up to the 33-month commit. One of the questions that often will come up in meetings like this is, Brad, why is it that those who engage in harm like this, the conscience, that rattles communities, why are they allowed to return? Why are they allowed to come back? And what I'll share with you is the answer really falls to determinate sentencing. Before determinate sentencing came online in the 80s, we had a system of parole. And with parole, you can well imagine that high-profile cases, especially ones of this nature, those individuals found it extremely difficult to have a parole board sign off on their release back into the community. Now, often when hearing that, a community will very well say, okay, Brad, thank you very much. We're okay with that. He can serve the entirety of his sentence. Thank you very much. But the reality we found from that research that we conducted was that recidivism rates were not where we wanted them to be as a state. This was not impacting reoffense behavior in a way that we wanted it to be impacting it. And so what we began to implement was the determinate sentencing program. And the way that works is that a sentence, when it's imposed, is broken into thirds. 2/3 of that sentence will be served in the institution if the stay is vacated, if they're not granted probation. By law, they will serve those 2/3. And 1/3 will be served in the community under supervised release. And the way that has shown to be successful is that all of those skills and tools taught in the institution through counseling and therapy programs are then translated into the community under the watchful eyes of corrections and law enforcement professionals to ensure for that final third that the individual is adhering to those expectations. And recidivism rates reflected its success. So let's go on to why in 2004 his probationary term was vacated. In 2004, Mr. Lincoln was convicted of criminal sexual conduct in the 3rd degree in Wright County. While he was under supervision, it became known that he had engaged in a relationship, and I'm going to use quotes around relationship. He had created comfort with a minor female and those who cared for her over the period of years, from her age of 12 to 15, and he was 18 to 22 at that time. And he exploited that relationship, that attention and affection was how he managed and maintained and manipulated this. And once brought to bear and brought to the awareness of the law enforcement system, he was convicted of this crime, the criminal sexual conduct 3rd degree, and received a 33-month commit for that sentence with a 10-year conditional release. Now that's different from the last one. So same amount of time, and as we talked about with determinate sentencing, now with a 10-year conditional release period on the back end. So what that does effectively is it takes that final third and it extends it for 10 years. So he has the additional benefit of all of these correctional supports and structures to ensure that continual maintenance of his behavior in the community. Other history I do want to share with you with Mr. Lincoln that is not registrable in its nature because it is not felony level, but it did contribute to the overall assessment of his risk. Is in 2001, Mr. Lincoln engaged in a series of conduct incidences that involved him in a vehicle exposing himself to people as he drove past them, children ages 6 and 9 and 10, and others whom he drove past. And so for those crimes, he received the maximum sentence allowable of gross misdemeanor, which is up to a year in jail, fines and fees and supervision. But know that that was weighted also in his risk level assessment and assignment. And ultimately, the totality of his conduct and behavior led to this prison chronology. So in December 2004, he entered prison after the stay for his initial criminal sexual conduct was vacated, and he received the conviction on his second subsequent criminal sexual sentence. And he was assessed and assigned a risk level of 3 in 2005. He came out onto supervision on that final third in 2006 onto intensive supervised release management and monitoring. At that time, he was under review for civil commitment in Wright County. In March 29th of 2008, the courts civilly committed Mr. Lincoln to the Minnesota Sex Offender Treatment Program at St. Peter as a sexually dangerous person. He entered into that program at that time and went all the way through treatment and programming, and at 2017, 8/16/17, he was reassessed for a risk and assigned a risk level 2. He had effectively mitigated his risk. And that's an important distinction to make sure you have, is that risk levels are dynamic. Someone assessed and assigned a level 1 today who goes on to engage in other risky conduct or behavior may very well find themselves being reassessed for a higher risk level. And as you see here with Mr. Lincoln, someone who is engaging in appropriate conduct, implementing mitigators and risk mitigation strategies in their lives may find their risk level going down. These are dynamic risk factors and risk levels. So in 2018, Mr. Lincoln was granted the opportunity at a provisional discharge from his state hospitalization, his civil commitment. And as of May 22nd, 2020, Mr. Lincoln was granted a full discharge from his civil commitment. And so, in summation of all of that, what you need to know today is that at this point, Mr. Lincoln is under no further court-imposed restrictions or requirements, with the exception of his being on the registry. He has no more probation, no more correctional intervention, no more state hospital intervention. He has been fully discharged and his rights have been restored to him. He must, however, maintain his information with law enforcement for life. And so for as long as he is subject to broad public notification, he will be known to you. But for the remainder of his life, he will be known to law enforcement. So for resources, as you're looking to augment your safety planning, both your family and community safety plans with this man's information and beyond, as your awareness has been broadened, remember that your best and first resource should be your Blue Earth Police Department. They are here to support you in your efforts. Do give them a call. If you see Mr. Lincoln or anyone who may be engaging in conduct that has just got you worried or has the hair on the back of your neck standing up, call 911. Let them know. As you've now seen, there are others who engage in and around communities who come and go all the time that we may not even know about, but law enforcement does. So by reporting anything that's causing you to be weary, or you fear someone may be in imminent harm, make sure you're contacting law enforcement. Other resources, as I mentioned earlier, as you're thinking about how to talk to your children about this important information, please do check out the Jacob Wetterling Resource Center. They have some tremendous tools and aids to assist as you think about how to talk to your kids in an age-appropriate and effective way. And in normal times, they're also available to even come down and provide information directly to community groups that are maybe interested. Another important provider is to share with you is the CADA group, the Committee Against Domestic Abuse. They are your local victim service provider. Now, inevitably, conversations like this, given the nature of what we're talking about and given the statistics of what we know, the odds are that somebody watching this today has been either directly impacted by or has supported or knows someone who has been impacted by this kind of harm. And having conversations like this inevitably can pull up old feelings and can bring you right back into a place you may have thought had been resolved or was gone. And I want you to know that you have resources available. I want this information readily available to you. If you need it yourself, please access them, or if you know of anyone who may benefit, please get this information to them as well. I'd like to wrap things up today. I know I've thrown a lot of information at you, and thank you for bearing with me. But if you take nothing else away with you, please let it be this. What we know about those who engage in this kind of harm and who come through the complete risk management system our state has, those who've gone through it successfully and who've made it into the community, 90% of them do not go on to reoffend in a same or similar fashion. 90% of those who do engage in this kind of harm are known to their victims, and they use that relationship to exploit that access, to confuse their victims, or to manipulate or coerce them into not telling. That means that 90% of the harm that's going on in our communities is being perpetrated by those whom we do not know, who have not become known to the system. And so having that broad awareness is just so critical. Folks, it really does come down to that social proximity piece, not geographical proximity. It's that relationship component that is so much more exploitable by those who mean to do harm. We know that those individuals who do mean to do harm, they travel in and around our state. They enter communities, neighborhoods, counties, townships daily. Where their head hits the pillow at night is where their risk is at its lowest. Where those who we know about spend their waking hours is so much more telling. And that's where we want our awareness. I have some additional resources that you'll see in this presentation that are available to you. Just know that this is the tip of the iceberg of information. You will go on, no doubt, to find other resources. All I want to make sure is to say that be careful with where you get your resources. Make sure they're from reputable agencies. Start with places that are on this list, and then you can grow beyond that and share what you find among your community as well so that they can apply the same information that you've found. And then lastly, as far as state resources go, I want to steer you to, I think, two important ones. One being the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension. Now, like I'd mentioned earlier, the BCA Predatory Offender Registry is for law enforcement purposes only. However, the BCA does maintain a criminal history search function. And anyone who's been convicted of a crime in our state would be on this system, readily accessible for you. All you need is a first name, last name, and date of birth. And this is one of those tools for those parents and loved ones who may be vetting somebody to become their new softball coach or to babysit their kids or tutor their kids. And I would argue that anyone unwilling to provide you with the first name, last name, and their date of birth probably isn't worthy of being on your short list of consideration. Other tools for you to utilize are on the Minnesota Department of Corrections website. All of the data I've thrown at you today is available there in its pure form for you to read through and scrutinize and draw your own conclusions. If you're like me and naturally skeptical of some guy from St. Paul sitting in front of you throwing pie charts at you, by all means check this information out yourself. If you cannot find it, my information will be available as well. Call me and I'll make sure you can get there to find this data. We also maintain on the DOC website our offender locator function. This is for any individual that is currently under the DOC jurisdiction, regardless of their offense, whether it's a sex offense or otherwise. If you've read of a case in the paper or you're aware of something that's gone on or you've been impacted by an offense and you want to know what's happening with that individual, this is your search tool to find out more. And then lastly, the public registered search function. Those 400 and some leveled individuals that are subject to broad public notification that I'd thrown at you earlier, this is where you'll find them. You can search by city, zip code, county, or you can say leave all the search functions empty and show them all to me, and you can see every one of them. Now, typically in a meeting like this is where we would open it up to a Q&A, so I'm going to throw it back to the chief, and we'll go from there.
And I do have questions. Okay. Brad, why is he coming here?
That's a huge question, and that's one that we find often will come up in meetings like this, is how is it that he is coming here to Blue Earth? And the answer is with anybody who's had their rights restored, they are free to move around the state and the nation at large. And so many things bring people into communities, just as they brought, no doubt, many of you to communities like Blue Earth. Opportunities, housing availability, work availability, transportation, family supports, all of these components lead to why we go where we go. And no doubt is at play with Mr. Lincoln. He's found some supports here that are going to help him stay safe, stay accountable, and continue to live a quiet life here in Blue Earth.
Does Mr. Lincoln rent or own where he's living?
Sure, and that's another question that will often come up, and we want to know about his status. Is he a property owner? Who allowed him to live here? Whose door can I go knock on if I'm concerned about him? And the reality is that wouldn't be information that's publicly available. Know that law enforcement is aware, but again, knowing that what put him in the community is less of an interest, as you've seen from this information, as to his conduct in the community. Because even if he lived outside of the city limits, even if he lived in a neighboring community, Blue Earth has something that he utilizes, some support, and he will likely would frequent the community. And so that broader awareness is so much more telling than if we were to see him leave here. If he moved out tomorrow, would Blue Earth be any more or less at risk, or would we want anyone's awareness to be heightened or diminished? And the answer is I want that awareness to remain heightened regardless of whether he's here or not, definitely.
So, Brad, we've heard about cities that enact ordinances to keep sex offenders out. What can you tell us about cities that have tried that?
Sure, definitely. And that's usually where one of those big misperceptions will come up is community members often will hear through their networks, their resources and the people they communicate with that they believe that there was a restriction about proximities, distances from where children congregate. And that could be any place, right? I mean, it could be our schools, our daycares, dance studios, just bike paths in general and things of that nature. And that's perpetuated by those ordinances that have been brought into existence. Now, something to be aware of is that the state does not have an ordinance. And when those individuals who are on supervision are placed out into the community, that is taken into consideration, certainly making sure that they're not being placed in a position where they would be set up for failure or someone may be put into harm's way. But with a community, one of the realities is the very thing that makes a community a community is that it's comprised of places where children congregate. You cannot find a community in the state of Minnesota that does not have places like parks. Most cities have park ordinances where if a new city block is established within so many square feet, it must have a park. In places where children will exist. It would leave only rural Minnesota, and I can assure you rural Minnesotans have shared the same concerns with their communities as well. And so when it comes to those types of restrictions, the intention is good. And the intention is to mitigate risk and try to minimize the potential of harm. Unfortunately, what they end up doing is increasing risk. One of those dynamic risk factors we weigh is stability. And by destabilizing these individuals, by creating a situation where they have been essentially banned from a community, they've been barred and cannot live there, is they become homeless. And so now they're transient within that community, and it makes it much harder for community policing efforts because now he has to check in by law weekly with law enforcement, which is a huge tax on your department. And it's a whole lot harder for law enforcement to vet where they are when they become homeless. And so while it may prevent in some communities someone having a place to put their head on the pillow at night, it does not prevent them existing. And so that's one of those components. And where there have been cities that have enacted ordinance like this, they often find they run afoul of the courts and the law, is that it prohibits someone from living. And the reality is that if we thought, even remotely, that by keeping those who may harm someone away from those potential areas, if we thought that that would mitigate risk, we would certainly be giving it more credence. But we know from our data, and as you will check it out, you will see too, that where they live is not telling of what and who they harm. Remembering that they will come into communities oftentimes outside of where they reside to engage in the harm that they may have engaged in initially. So just keeping that in mind. It's a big conversation piece, and certainly if you need more information on it, I would encourage you to contact me, and we can make sure that we're getting you those questions answered.
So how close can Mr. Lincoln be to places like daycare, schools, parks, libraries, public pools, things like that?
Right, exactly, and that's kind of on that same coattail of the residency restriction question, and it's his rights have been restored, and so he may engage in all of the same conduct and behavior any one of us can. It has to be law-abiding. And so what that means is that you may very well see Mr. Lincoln at the library. You may see him at the pool with his own family. You may see him engaging in some of the very same activities at places where children may congregate, and that's why that awareness component is just so key. Because now, as your awareness has even been broadened beyond that here in the community, you ultimately know that anyone who may be here engaging in those types of activities is someone that we should be aware of. No one can be above our scrutiny. And it's just so important that we're aware of all people and all interactions that are being had, Mr. Lincoln included. But he can, and you will see him out in the community engaging in activities. Now, if you feel that something he's up to or engaging in is concerning to you, by all means, contact law enforcement, and they will happily come out and check it out and find out what's going on with him or anyone who may be up to potential harm in the community.
So what should I do if I see him talking to children?
Definitely. I think that's one right there where you wouldn't necessarily, I would never want to say anything that would diminish your awareness. I would not want to say, well, assume the best. Assume that there's a good reason for it, and then it's all good, healthy conversations. This is one where you would just notify local law enforcement. If you see something that concerns you, and as you become aware of him and as you can continue to see him in the community, you'll get to know where he goes, who he spends his time with, and how he uses his time. And so being aware of who he's communicating with, knowing the children in your neighborhood, which you no doubt will already do. And if you're seeing them engaging in conduct or contact with Mr. Lincoln and you're concerned, going to their parents, sharing with them this important information so that we know that they've at least made a fully informed choice if they have chosen to allow their children to have contact with him, or if he's chosen to have contact. But ultimately, if you're concerned, if you at all think this doesn't seem right, call law enforcement and get them involved.
Why doesn't he have any conditions?
So with Mr. Lincoln, as you may recall back from my earlier slides, he has served both his correctional time and now has been granted that full discharge from the MSOP or the state civil commitment side. So he has successfully completed, he has had his rights restored on the criminal side, and on the civil side, he's been granted his full privileges and liberties. And so his requirements and conditions are the same that fall on all of us: to remain law-abiding, to be good citizens, and to be quiet neighbors, definitely.
Brad, I've always heard that offenders who are civilly committed to the sex offender program in St. Peter never get out. How did he get out?
Yep, and that's definitely, I think, one of those big misperceptions is that once civilly committed, essentially we wash our hands and we say it's done. Well, the treatment program, the state's sex offender treatment program, has in its methods and procedures a graduated system which will ultimately conclude in, if it's effective, reducing risk, which is what we saw with Mr. Lincoln. And then once they've shown that reduction in risk, and they've started to engage in those healthy, proactive, stable types of conduct and behavior, then they are put out on a provisional discharge where they're under still the watchful guidance of a MSOP agent. Essentially, they function very much like a corrections agent, supporting them in the community, making sure they're adhering to all their tools and all their treatment skills and so on. And then ultimately, he petitioned the court for full discharge, and it was granted. And so that is how he and others like him find themselves in the community. And this is why we're always broader when we say those subject to broad public notification, because he is a level 2, which I'd mentioned is not subject to that broad notification piece. However, because of his past civil commitment, then law enforcement may provide that information to the community for your safety planning efforts.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Finally, I would like to let our community members know, I have met with Mr. Lincoln, as we do with all of our local sex offenders. Mr. Lincoln is well aware of the scrutiny he is going to be under. He is also well aware of the fact that we will be watching him a little bit more closely than we would a level 1 sex offender. He knows his expectations, or what we expect of him, and he seems amenable to doing his best to meet those expectations. We at the Blue Earth Police Department, we believe that a well-informed community is a safer community, and I thank you for taking the time to watch this important video.